During the holiness movement of the 19th century, a lot was happening in America. Much of the key social issues were centered in Western New York, and that is where the holiness movement was quite intense. As a matter of fact, that whole area became known as the burned over district, since the Holy Spirit was so active in convicting people and creating life transformation in both people and issues. Rochester was a hotbed for cultural foment. Susan B. Anthony and women's rights, Frederick Douglass, the great orator for oppressed people, and the Methodist Episcopal Church was quite strong. Having graduated from school in Connecticut, Benjamin Titus Roberts, a smart and multi-talented man, became a Methodist Episcopal pastor in Western New York. His wife, Ellen Stowe, had been mentored for some time by Phoebe Palmer in New York City. She was deeply committed to the full salvation that Ms. Palmer talked about and the holy life. B.T., Benjamin Titus, B.T. was influenced by this, along with others in the annual conference. Benjamin recognized the shortcomings of the M.E. Church to address deeply troubling social issues. And there was a general apathy in the hearts of people and pastors alike. So Roberts began to write about matters that challenged the status quo. There are great books and resources you can probe to get a much fuller understanding of all of these things than I could ever provide here briefly. But in short, he and Ellen pastored Methodist Episcopal churches in Western New York, trying to lead their people to deep transformation and a prophetic impact in both the denomination and society. The Regency Party at that time became a significant power center in the church, and secret decisions that were made in the Masonic Lodge eroded the transparency of a vibrant spirituality. As with many other movements before it, Methodism was succumbing to the ravages of culture and becoming less potent in making a real difference. B.T. and Ellen preached, taught, and wrote about these issues, calling for abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, free pews in the churches, a return to the spiritual vibrancy of Wesley's tenets of holistic restoration and full surrender, a passion for holiness of life, and a responsibility to address systemic issues in areas like agriculture, human rights, legislation, mostly calling for a return to understanding holiness of life, both personal and social. Some of his articles were published without Roberts' consent, and ultimately he was expelled from the Methodist Episcopal Church as a minister. Clearly, he rocked the boat of the structure a little too much. Seeing no other alternative, he sought wisdom from others and actually met with about 70 lay persons and clergy members in Pekin, New York, under a tree, to discuss next steps that included a new movement that would become known as the Free Methodist Church. You can actually visit the park where they met if you're ever in Western New York. The word free originally, and for many years, referred to Methodist churches that would be free to all. Of course, that word free came to mean a great deal given the issues of the day that were actively debated. Freedom from secret societies like the Masonic Lodge, freedom of slaves, freedom of the Spirit in worship, freedom to sit in church without being charged in a discriminating system, freeing inland farmers to be able to move their crops eastward. This was a great time of foment in that area. B.T. Roberts also had a deep heart for education. In fact, he always seemed to have an inner tension between being a churchman or an educator. That fork in the road seemed always present for him. He and Ellen embraced both. After the founding of the Free Methodist Church on August 23 of 1860, he went on to buy the local tavern in North Chili, New York, and convert it into a seminary for training Christian workers. Known as Chili Seminary, the school was founded in 1866, and the building still stands there. It was later renamed Chesbro Seminary in honor of a major philanthropist and follower named A.M. Chesbro. It became a work farm where students worked to pay their way through school, which was really innovative in that day. Today, that school is known as Roberts Wesleyan University, and it sits on the same land where the Roberts conducted the school and led the denomination, and next, exactly to where Roberts is buried. B.T. and Ellen loved the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they didn't want to leave. So in forming the new denomination, the structure remained nearly exact, with a few exceptions. The Constitution of the Free Methodist Church has some clearer statements that signal the difficulties of that day and guide the church with wisdom today. For example, the Constitution declares that seats in the Free Methodist Church shall be forever free. There will be equal lay and clergy presence at all levels of governance. Membership in any secret society is prohibited. Take some time to read those first chapters of the Book of Discipline and see if you can recognize the issues that are being addressed from those early years, and which remain principles that we live by today. Sadly, the new formed denomination did not support its first general superintendent, which the title was later changed to be called a bishop. It didn't support the first general superintendent in his plea for the ordination of women. It wasn't until much later that the church accepted the urgings of Roberts to ordain women to ministry at all levels of the church. And we've been rather slow and frankly still struggle in putting that into practice. Likewise, the new denomination became quite institutional and frightened of the spirited activity of the Free Methodist Pentecost bands in the early 20th century under the leadership of Vivian Dake. In trying to control and structure them, the bands ultimately left, and a lot of passion and vibrancy for church multiplication and the visible work of the Spirit was lost. In the 20th century, as fundamentalism and modernism became divisive, the early efforts of people like Bishop Myron Boyd to help shape the growing evangelical movement in the middle had some effect. But by later in the century, much of our unique contribution as a denomination was overshadowed. Along with many other denominations, the Free Methodist Church was so influenced by the more propositional and more bounded thinking of generic evangelicalism that our own pastors and people were not as active in civil rights as our forefathers likely would have been. We, along with most other churches, became concerned about being accepted in the new evangelical movement and allowed ourselves to be formed by a different stream of thinking and a more general evangelical approach. Thankfully, our DNA was strong enough to survive, and it's begun to recover. I remember on being asked about my own alignment with the American evangelical movement when I became the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. I responded by saying that as a Free Methodist, I could not describe myself as being in the middle of that generic evangelical stream. As a Wesleyan holiness person, I certainly considered myself an evangelical, but required that the term evangelical not be constrained by bounded propositions that serve as a litmus test to authenticity. Clearly, the evangelical leaders of that day concurred, since I served in that role for a few years. Over our history as a denomination, there are many, many regional stories that add substance, texture, and context to this overarching narrative. Please find somebody in your area that knows and ask them to tell the stories that have been passed down for generations. For example, talk to people in the Northeast of America who are the recipients of the stories of the Western New York area, the land, the buildings at Roberts Wesleyan University, the names of the people there. Or consider the story of Clyde Burnett, a pastor in Arizona who moved to Southern California, married a woman who was a former missionary to Japan. While pastoring in California, he was largely responsible for starting the Pacific Coast Japanese Conference of the Free Methodist Church. As I talked to his great-granddaughter, Claudette Fitch, who is the wife of a former superintendent, I was amazed to learn that her grandfather on the other side, Claude Watson, and her great-grandfather Burnett worked together to buy the properties of Japanese people who were taken to the internment camps during World War II. That way, when they were released, they would only need to pay $1 to get their land back into their name instead of losing it to the government. Holiness in action. By the way, Claude Watson was a Free Methodist pastor and lawyer who incorporated the denomination in the state of California. Or other stories. Listen to stories about the Beers in Seattle who started Seattle Pacific University as a response to the great secular universities of the Northwest. Or Hogue in the Midwest, or John Wesley Redfield and the Stories in Illinois, or the camp meetings in Texas with the Nazarene churches there. You have a rich history with people around who can tell it. Listen. Let me wrap up this episode with a few characteristics that seem to shine through in the Free Methodist Church as Wesleyan holiness people. We don't always get it right, believe me, but we do our best to be the people God called out to be Free Methodist. We tend to be more centered than bounded. In other words, rather than draw a circle or a hedge made up of doctrine, behaviors, social positions, and political positions, we seek to be more anchored in the center of our identity, and then we reach out from there. Instead of looking at the boundary and judging people whether they're in or out in determining their spiritual vitality, we tether ourselves to the center of who we are, and then we engage as much as we can with anyone around us, even if it means we get a little dirty in the process and maybe even are misunderstood at times. Secondly, we tend to be more descriptive than prescriptive. In other words, we don't want to bring a formula of doctrine, dogma, and behaviorism to our communities and then impose it as if to fix them. What we want to do is to invite the Holy Spirit to be free to act through us in whatever way God chooses, and then describe what God is doing. We watch God work through our efforts and describe it as completely traceable only to the Spirit, not our prescriptive plans or doctrines. And thirdly, we tend to be more relational than propositional. In other words, because salvation is really a relationship, not a doctrine that requires compliance, we seek to invite people to walk with Jesus and let God transform them. And we simply walk humbly with God and other people in natural relational ways that allows them to discover Jesus with the help of the Holy Spirit in their own time and way. Let me remind you of the many people around you that are sources to help you know the story of how the Free Methodist Church came to be. Take time to talk to them. And also, here are some great books that will give you a far better account than these short minutes. Look them up online and take some time to read and learn. Remember, the best way to find your future is to embrace your past. Check out these books as an assignment. Bishop Leslie Marston's book entitled From Age to Age, A Living Witness, a comprehensive description of the history of the Free Methodist Church through 1960. Dr. David McKenna's book entitled A Future with a History, a history that picks up in 1960 and continues through about the year 2000. And Dr. Howard Snyder's book, Populous Saints. It's a big book. You can find an abridged version of this one, edited by Dan Runyon, if you'd like. Above all else, refrain from limiting the story of the Free Methodist Church to a few quick pages or paragraphs. Let the Holy Spirit use our family history to inspire and fill you with amazement and thankfulness.